Adam Robbins. I'm head of science at a place called the Regis School, which is a large coastal comprehensive just along from Durrington on the south coast. And I'm here today to talk to you about a concept called locked out learners, not to be confused with lockout learners, which is the entire population of the country right now. So there's my Twitter handle if you want to get in touch with me or ask any questions. Obviously, we can't do this face-to-face today. Feel free to. But today I want to start by thinking about those students. And I'm sure the inverted commas give you a clue there that I'm not talking about our favorite students. I'm talking about some of the most frustrating students, okay? I'm talking about the ones that try to avoid work as much as possible. Maybe they do it through all sorts of different ways, but most of the common ones I've experienced are disruptive behaviours, calling out, making noises, stupid stuff like that. We've got kind of your classic opt-outers, your sleepers, your heads on desk, your groaners. Just go, don't know, whatever, don't know. Not even engaging in the problem. And then my favorite are the crisis generators, the ones that will find any small infraction against them to create a big scene, storm off and go see their head of year or head of house, because then they don't have to be in lesson. And they're, constantly yo-yoing in and out of the lesson with strops and theatrics. So locked out learners, we've defined it as students who will provide no discretionary effort. So they're trying to avoid the pain of failure. They often need a lot of scaffolding, these students. We use the analogy of boiling the frog, slowly heating it up so the frog doesn't jump out. And so we have simple steps, and they get tripped over by the tiniest hurdles, hence the hilarious photograph. But students aren't always that way. If you go down and look in, reception in year 1 and year 2, my daughter's in year 1 at the moment, pretty much everyone, no matter what their ability is at that age, is, not locked out of their education. They're actively trying to get better. But over time, some students develop these habits and these strategies to try and lock themselves out of learning. And today I'm going to try and unpick some of that idea, maybe looking at some psychology and some research, and then look at some of the solutions that we're trying to kind of unlock them, I suppose, and get them back on track. So one of the barriers that people sometimes talk about is the curriculum. They say, the curriculum is just too hard. The curriculum is not appropriate for students. And while I can kind of understand that this idea of a curriculum that is more demanding would obviously disadvantage the students at the bottom in terms of how they're going to be successful in an exam, I like to point out that locked out learners existed in some of the easiest curriculums. Let's talk about the early 2000s in science. The early 2000s were assessed through 6 modular multiple choice questions. I mean, you can't get multiple choice tests. You can't get more different to what we're doing now, with the coursework and everything like that, where you could basically guarantee a certain grade to a student if they followed your instructions. Yet we still had students that wouldn't do those things. So I don't think the curriculum is a place to look for answers. I think it's just an easy target to blame if it's a curriculum that you don't personally believe in. If you think the decisions that the last government made to change it are not what you would do in your belief structure, then it's obvious that you're going to look to the curriculum to blame. But I don't think it's a very valid place to place the blame. I do think presentation is a massive thing. I think the idea of book looks and the idea of focusing on presentation, while well-meaning in terms of setting up standards in a school or creating some sort of consistency and some sort of kind of shared value of we take pride in our work, that has value, I suppose. I can agree with that, from a kind of school leadership point of view, from a department leadership point of view. It's nice to see students take pride in their work. But there are negative consequences to all decisions we make in schools. And one of the problems with presentation is, what about those students that aren't very good at presenting? Does that mean that their work has less value? What about how conversely those students that presentation is the thing they're really, really good at? Okay, so I can think back to last year. There were 2 girls in my bottom set, year 11, and they were both exceptional artists, and they had beautiful handwriting, and they were hard workers, and their books looked absolutely incredible, and they would do work until you asked them a question they didn't know. And as soon as you asked them to do something that was slightly outside of their comfort zone in terms of their knowledge, they would always just stop. And I always found that quite strange, because they weren't naughty, they weren't disruptive students, they were hardworking students, they wanted to do well, and they did quite well, compared to their kind of prior ability towards the end of the year. But what they would do is they would stop because they wouldn't want a wrong answer in their book, because their book was supposed to be neat because it showed how proud they were of their work. And this is a barrier that sometimes adversely gets put up when teachers harp on about presentation a lot in books. So there's a possible consequence that some students will take those messages that we give them about presentation and infer that to mean they don't make mistakes in their book. And we know as educators that mistakes are some of the most useful things a student can put in their book. I'd rather they make all the mistakes in their book than in the exam, and I'm sure you would. But sometimes that message we give can be misconstrued and leave to students becoming locked out. Pupil premium is often one of the things that come up, well, he's pupil premium, well, she's pupil premium, what to expect? Personally, I think that's a load of crap. The highest achieving students in our school are pupil premium students. The lowest achieving students in our school are also pupil premium students. Ergo, pupil premium is a bit of nonsense. It's a wide net. It catches way too many students to be useful to measure any kind of attitude to learning. And it's incredibly bigoted in some ways to assume just because a student has a certain environmental factor in their upbringing that they were predisposed to behave in certain ways or have certain levels of success. Yes, when you look at all pupil premiums across the country or in a cohort, they tend to do worse than other students, but it's too broad a measure to be a reason for students to be behaving like this. It's more of an interesting anecdote at this stage, in my personal opinion. I do think, however, parental views on education is something that is really important. How a child's parents interact with the school, the comments they make about the school, the language they use, the emphasis they put on the child's education are huge factors. But again, things we can't control in the classroom. So not much use for us worrying about that at this stage. I think for us, it comes down to remembering that learning is an incredibly risky activity. Every time a teenage student puts their answers on a page or says something out loud, they risk being wrong in front of their peer group. And as we'll get to, peer group is obviously a huge thing for teenagers. And so there's a risk in any learning activity. If you don't believe me, just go, grab a musical instrument you never played before, sit your family down and start learning it in front of them and see how frustrated you get. Because we often forget that as people that have done quite a lot of learning in our lives and have a certain amount of expertise in our environment, we are easy to forget how difficult some students find it and how emotive that difficulty can feel. So I started looking at student motivation. David Adao and Nick Rose's book on psychology was kind of one of my starting points here. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a link to an Impact article. I think Adam Boxer wrote it about the research to motivation. And one of the things that became really obvious is it's obviously an incredibly difficult thing to separate out. There's too many factors involved. It's a very murky subject, but over time we can start to build some general patterns. So one of the things that we've learned is that simple rewards don't work. They work quite well for really young kids, I suppose. Do this and you get a sticker is a classic way. Think of potty training is a common way people use to motivate their young children. But if we consider the kind of classic California State Attendance Award scenario where they gave every student who had 100% attendance, or I think it was 97% attendance, a certificate to say thank you for your high attendance. And then they came back a semester later and nearly all of them had lower attendance because they have this idea that they're now above expectation. And when you tell people they're above expectation, there's a kind of instinctive reaction to that where people go, oh, okay, that means I've got one in my back pocket that I can use if I fancy it. So, I've got 100% attendance from semester one. I'm a bit tired today. I'm a bit run down. I'll take the day off. I'll have a duvet day and it's fine because I'm above expectation. I'll still be fine. And it can be really difficult rewards because they can have these kind of unforeseen negative consequences. As a general rule, any reward strategy you use will have different effects on different people. There's no one fixed idea that will be uniformly received. Some students, if you berate them, they will work harder. Other students, if you berate them, they will not. Some students, if you praise them, they will work harder. Some students, if you praise them, they'll actually take their foot off the accelerator and they'll slow down because they'll think they're going too fast. So, different reward systems can work in the short term, but sooner or later you find that gaps are appearing where they're not catching everyone. Some people talk about this idea of making things relevant all the time. So that was something of about 10 years ago, this idea that there would be kind of the local, the national, and the regional picture to all content. I can see how that has its benefits, I suppose, if you're especially talking about things like geography or physics, where people can see stuff happening all around them. But in some ways, I think there's a moral problem with this. The idea that a thing has to be relevant to a student's life now for it to be useful is a dangerous message to give people, because actually a lot of education is not directly useful straight away. Education has long-term benefits. The student does not know when they will need to know that information, but you never know when it comes in useful. This whole idea of cultural capital has a huge aspect of this. And so I think morally, using relevance as our only way of motivating students is probably a bad idea. When you really start to look at the literature, the one thing that starts to come out is the idea of competence and success. So most people like doing things they're good at and don't like doing things they're not good at. So if we can find ways of breeding success into subjects, then we will find students should be more motivated. I suppose this links in with Bjork's desirable difficulties a lot, and a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today can easily be looked through that lens. But some people say it's all about relationships. Nope, sorry. It's not about relationships, is it? Because if it was about relationships, then we've got no hope in hell, because no one can be liked by everyone. And to make one person like you is a completely different behavior set than making someone else like you, because people are individuals. I think this quote from Doug Lemov sets it up really well. So I'll give you a minute just to read this. I think this is amazing in terms of an observation. This idea that it's not about the relationship. It's not about making the student like you. It's about you having a certain amount of authenticity because you can get the job done. At the end of the day, most students, if you talk to them and they go, what do you like about your favorite teacher? They will often say, they help me when I'm stuck, or they'll explain it in a way that I get it. They judge teachers not by how many jokes they tell or how nice their mustache is, or if they teach PE. They judge them by how effective they are at making the students feel successful. And so I saw this quote in a blog of Becky Allen's, and I think it's really, really, really appropriate in this situation, and also for almost all school-based decisions that students make. So I'll give you a minute to read this, and then we'll carry on. So what we're talking about here is this idea of success and belonging. These are the two key things. And some students get that from school. 95% of students in a school that has strong culture will get both of these things in the school building. And that's probably one of the key drivers for that school's success. So it'd be very hard to have that in place and not have successful students. But some students don't. But it keeps coming back to this idea of success and of kind of peer acceptance and the risks of these things. John Haidt is one of the writers that talks about the psychology of motivation and psychology of happiness and why people do things. He's a moral psychologist, essentially. And he came up with the elephant, the rider, and then this idea of the path as well, which is about change. So basically, the elephant represents your base moral instincts. They're unique to you. You could argue from a cognitive point of view, they're essentially a schema built up through your life experiences about how you react to things. So if I was to tell you I was a vegan, as an example, you would have an instant reaction to that based on your moral opinion of veganism. So you may be like a vegan yourself, and you'd be like, yeah, brilliant, I'm a vegan too, we are the same. You may be completely against vegans and think all they do is spend all their time telling you they're a vegan instead of actually doing anything useful for the planet. And they're both valid opinions because they're your opinion. I can't control that. Neither of them are my opinion, for the record, and I'm not a vegan. So don't switch this presentation off if you're in that second group. But what I'm trying to say is you have that inside you. You cannot change that easily. That is an innate feeling you have. What you do have, because you're humans, is you have kind of a level of consciousness above that we're calling the rider. Now, the rider tries to direct the elephant. So let's say you're in that second category and you're like, vegans, oh, God, but your rider will know that that is not the right direction to think. And it will try and steer you towards a middle ground, okay? Make the right choice. It's not nice to talk to people like that. And so it will probably make a decision for you of not saying those words, maybe, unless you're in a certain social setting where you think those things are acceptable. And if we look at it from the student's point of view, that rider, we can talk to that rider a little bit, but that rider has got no power, really. Okay, teenagers aren't very well adapted with the mental discipline. They don't have a lot of experience of feeling one thing and acting in their own best interest in a different way. Their rider is quite weak. What their riders tend to do is they tend to justify the elephant's behavior. So when their elephant veers off in one direction, let's say a path of self-destruction with poor behavior, what the rider will be doing is it will be looking for reasons to justify that behavior, to make them feel successful. So the rider will be saying, of course it's right to flip that desk over, Jaden. The teacher didn't say your name correctly, and that's a completely unacceptable thing for a human being to do. And so this reaction is completely justified because you didn't give them a second warning or whatever system it is. Students that are in these kind of situations are always looking for those minute details and trying to pick them out. And when they say those details, they're trying to justify their behavior to themselves. Their rider is trying to tell everyone that the direction the elephant is taking them on is the direction they always wanted to go. So if we want to try and change these students, we need to try and talk to the elephant. We need to make them feel a bit of success, and we need to make the changes that they have to have in their behavior really, 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 really small. Okay. When we're talking to the rider, we need to be clear in signaling why we're doing our things. So there's no point introducing a strategy to a student and not explain why you're introducing that. You need to be saying to them, I want you to use this approach when you're doing your calculations, because this approach guarantees you get at least 2 marks, even if you can't understand the question fully, as an example. And then we want to make sure we try and build cohesion in the group. So we want to have common habits, shared rituals, common routines, so that everyone is doing the same thing. That way there's a feeling of belonging, and the success can be shared with each other, and we create a kind of momentum in the forward direction. Now, habits are obviously a big part of this. If you can't establish positive habits, then how are you going to do it? And unfortunately for us, habits are incredibly difficult to do. Okay. Often when you look up habit research, you get a number, 66 days. It takes 66 days to build a habit. Yeah. You want to stop smoking? Just stop smoking for 66 days. Job done. You want to start, doing Joe Wicks's P lessons? Just do it for 66 days and you'll do it for the rest of your life. Poor person. But actually, when you look at this, it can be only as low as 18. So for example, a glass of wine a day, it only takes 18 days of that in a row to develop a habit in it, because it's considered a pleasurable activity. Whereas for some people in the study, it took them 254 consecutive days of going to the gym before they actually wanted to go to the gym and it developed a habit. Now, that's most of a year. So we can see the over-under on 66 days is quite large. And so some of our students are not going to be able to build habits within a week or in a term even. We're going to need to be very consistent with these things to make sure they can build these positive habits. Now, when we look at it through a cognitive behavior therapy lens, we can use Beck's negative triad to try and understand how a student is thinking at the time when they're in this learning situation, which makes them make a choice to opt out of their learning. Okay, so Beck's negative triad is a really useful thing. It's basically this idea that if you don't have a certain amount of positive view on yourself, I suppose you could call that self-esteem if you chose to, then you project that onto the world, and then you see no hope in the future, and that makes you feel bad. And so you go round the triangle again and again and again and again, and proving yourself right the whole time, because you're a waste of space. So obviously you don't know the answer to 2B, and obviously your teacher thinks you're a complete idiot and hates you, and obviously you're going to fail your GCSE, so what's the point? And you can see why students end up in quite emotional states in these situations. Now, changing those events, Albert Ellis invented a thing called REPT, which you would probably understand now as kind of cognitive behavioral therapy in terms of what people do to change these things. And what he said is that we've got events, the activating event, it's over here, okay, activating event, and then they lead in and feed into the students' prior held beliefs. So the students' beliefs are kind of like their emotional baggage, I suppose. And then that creates emotional consequences, i.e. how they feel about things, and they behave according to those feelings. What we're trying to do is we try and do that bottom box there, disputing irrational beliefs. If we can disrupt this belief process, we can make them change the emotional consequences and therefore the expected behavior. That's the idea behind it. Obviously, it's easier said than done. And trying to apply it without some sort of therapy process is quite difficult, but there are some small wins that we can make in the way we do stuff. So to summarize, our silver bullet is going to have competency all the way through it. It's going to be about filling that gap in their chest, that feeling of success. It also wants to build useful revision habits. There's no point students learning something that they can't then apply to an exam situation, because that's how they're going to be judged. It needs to be incredibly consistent and to a point of being quote unquote idiot proof, I suppose. You need to find valid praise. Yeah, so praise that is useful and measurable, and not just be able to be just brushed over by the negative thought cycles and things like the triad coming in the way of it. And it needs to kind of direct how this can accelerate and show how this will then be a strategy that will pay off in the long term. And it needs to be so damn easy at the beginning that the student is almost guaranteed 100% success on that very, very first step. Like, they have to essentially just be tripping over themselves to get it wrong on purpose, because that first step is so incredibly easy. It doesn't stay that way. It's obviously going to build over time, and that time will be different for each student, but more importantly, there'll be a consensus forming within that group. Fortunately, I don't have that for you, I'm afraid. But please don't switch off, because I do have some ideas, but it's important to know that there's no such thing as a silver bullet in education, and anyone that claims they have the solution for anything in education is a snake oil salesman and clearly doesn't know what they're talking about. But these things might help. So I think knowledge organisers are really interesting, and I think a lot of people get knowledge organisers wrong, personally. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we use knowledge organisers as an assessment tool, not as a kind of repository of every piece of knowledge that's ever needed to be learned. Big fan of SLOP, which stands for Shed Loads of Practice. And if you're interested in developing things like booklets and SLOP, then I'd recommend, even if you're not a science teacher, to go to the cogsci website, cogsci.wordpress.com, and there's a free CPD module that talks through all the research and all the theory behind SLOP and how we set it up. But essentially, I'm a big believer in the idea that students should have ownership of the knowledge they're about to be taught. It shouldn't be secret and hidden behind a veil to elucidate awe and wonder when the time's appropriate. I don't think that's useful. I think that sends the message to the weaker students that they're in the dark and they're always going to be in the dark. I think we're much better to illuminate the curriculum and say to students, this is our topic. This is what we're going to learn. This is how we're going to learn it. Look what we're going to be able to do by the end of it. And I'm going to take you through it. And you can trust me, we're going to get this done. And then I'm going to talk about phased quizzing. This is about this idea of ramping up the difficulty and how you can structure that easily using free resources that are available online called retrieval roulettes. So with the knowledge organisers, I think when you structure a knowledge organiser, personally, I think you do need to cover the specification. That's important. And you do need to organise it in a way that's easy to direct students to. So in this case, we've got a bit of physics here. The important thing is it's going to prioritize the acquisition of key language. So keywords are going to be the most important part of the knowledge organizer, and it's going to be built for assessment. And let me explain a little bit about what I mean there. So what I mean is any diagrams or any key points of information that need to be learned need to be separated out so they are easy to identify and they are easy to assess. So here's an example of a knowledge organizer for atomic structure. Okay, it's got the keywords at the beginning like we talked about. Everything's broken down into boxes. The diagram can be assessed. I'm just going to talk about how we could ramp up this assessment. So every student in year 10 and 11 has a copy of this as part of the school's policy on how we use knowledge organizers, and they're instructed to spend time learning the definitions through using simple techniques like look, cover, write, check, or simple quizzing worksheets that we'll get to in a minute, or flashcards. And those things are shown in class and modeled, and so every student is trained up. So we would set them just that part maybe to look at the beginning of the topic. Maybe that part on the second lesson, say. And then what we'll say is we're going to assess these things. So the first time we assess these things, they'll be given something that is incredibly similar to what they're learning. The idea being it's completely foolproof. If they've learned the key words, they will get these right. They're in the same order. Everything is the same. It's an effort-based situation. Any student that fails to do this, it's quite easy to have a conversation with saying, yeah, you could have done this. You're just not putting in enough effort. You need to prioritize this. So, and we can put in sanctions and things like that to motivate if you really want to. It's up to your school. Next time they come, we're going to make it a little bit more difficult. So now they have to actually recall the sentence instead of the key word. In a few situations, some of the numbers are missing. So we're acting the level of challenge. It's still low stakes, but there's slightly more increased difficulty. Third time, we're after more work being done and more thinking being done because they have to recall definitions. Now their definitions might not be perfect, so it's important to unpick those. And then finally, we're going to sample the domain that we're testing, but we're going to sample it in a much less structured way. So we've got a mixture of words in a different order, and we're actually going to ask them to draw that box of an atom. Now that would have been taught in lesson. So it's not like we're just expecting them to do that from the definition in the knowledge organizer. We're going to teach that, and this is just a way of us checking that they've paid attention and make sure we can inform our further planning. When it comes to revision, or this actually bled more into kind of everyday teaching for me, I suppose, as well, now that we're devoting a bit more of our everyday lessons to retrieval practice and revision activities. Well, locked out learners don't revise. They just turn up and go, I didn't revise. So much easier to live a result if you say you didn't revise. It's like the most protective bit of armor you can give your ego. Maybe they do revise, but what they do is they'll just do something really easy. I tend to call this positive procrastination, because they're doing something, so they feel good that they're doing it, but they're not actually achieving anything. So it's just like procrastinating. They might as well be watching, anything. It's not really paying attention to it. Copying notes out is essentially worthless because there's no thought involved in it. So it's a bit of a waste of time, but it makes them feel good inside that they've done something, and they can say to their parents, oh, I've revised. They can say to their teacher, I revised for an hour. And then we get this thing called the Golem effect, which is a negative triad, essentially, where they're not successful. So then they lose their motivation. Why would they revise next time? They failed last time, and they even watched a video, So this kind of process of revision needs to be completely embedded into actual lessons at the beginning. So it's worth, and the first topics you're having with a class at the beginning of the year in September, hopefully, fingers crossed, world is back to normal by September, taking your time and modeling these processes in a really low stake and supportive setting. If you're dealing with these kind of students, which are more common, but not entirely in a kind of low ability setting scenarios, then it's worth spending time on these things early to get those habits right. So what you do is you set up essentially a quiz. Okay. The quiz uses the knowledge organizer to support, so the students can literally look up the answers to the first few questions. But then as the questions develop, they then fade into a bit more application, or they require an inference based on the knowledge in the knowledge organizer. And so they kind of are building a foundation from this really, really obvious recall. Just got to copy it out. That's all you've got to do right now. Just get going. To now they've got to think about those things, but the answers to the first few questions they've done will kind of give them clues. Maybe it'll be about putting together two of the ideas into one answer or something like that, so they can be guided through it. And then staff spend all their time going round, obviously circulating the class purposefully, checking on people, stopping, addressing any misconceptions that turn up, classic teacher stuff, bread and butter. And then what they can do is they can take that copy of that quiz home, and they can take a blank one, and then they can quiz themselves without the knowledge organizer. When they get that right, then they should know they're more confident and be able to address some sort of application through exam questions or unfamiliar situations. So it is in some ways a guidelines of shed loads of practice. In some ways, it's about just making sure they spend enough time exposed to the information and actually have to think about the information in multiple ways. It's just not in a kind of booklet format or in a kind of 150 questions straight off the go, which is the kind of standard SLOP format. So here's some knowledge organizer bits. This is the history of the periodic table. It's got the groups in, metals and non-metals, all these kind of things. And then it goes on and talks about group one and separation techniques. This is all part of the same knowledge organizers series that I showed you before. And then what we did is we built these question banks. So I say built them, we stole them. If you go to Adam Boxer's retrieval roulette page, you'll find retrieval roulettes for large numbers of subjects, history, geography, all sorts of different exam boards, science, the works. And what we did is we take them as our starting point and take our first kind of 10 questions from them. And then from there, you build the other questions to fit in. So if you look down towards question 12, for example, what did Niels Bohr discover? It's just another way of looking at the problem. It's not a particularly complex problem, but it's just making them think just a tiny bit more. Whereas when you get to the end, okay, we're asking more complex questions that they need to do a little bit more work on. So these two strategies, using knowledge organizers, making sure the students have access to them, using shed loads of practice in your lessons so they can build some sort of competency in what they need to know, and then structuring their revision where they do lots and lots and lots of simple retrieval quizzes is a really useful strategy for us. And it's really helped our less motivated students have an increased amount of motivation. It doesn't work for everyone, obviously, but we can win the battles we can win at the end of the day. You can't force a student to learn. Some students are very, very adamant that they won't learn. But by having these kind of structures in place, when a student decides they do want to learn, it could be the day before the exam, it could be 3 months before the exam. But when they do decide they want to learn, they have all the resources they need and they know exactly the right strategies that they need to do, instead of having to kind of figure it out for themselves and panic and get stressed. So I hope you found that useful. If you want to ask me any questions or anything, feel free to get in touch with me through Twitter. That's totally fine. And I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to seeing the other presentations that people give. Take care, stay safe, and I hope you found that helpful.